The suitcase under the bed. You never forget the smell of a dead man hidden in a place he never belonged. Especially when you were the one who found him, folded like a broken puppet, stuffed inside an old suitcase beneath a moldy bed. I wasn't a killer. Not then. Anyway. But the day I met Yuri, death started living with me like a second tenant. It began in silence. A flat too quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. A pillowcase too light. And a suitcase too full of secrets. There are things landlords expect to deal with. Late rent, broken pipes, maybe a squatter or two. But a corpse? A corpse with its limbs bent backwards and eyes wide open? That's something else entirely. Some people open closets to find skeletons. I opened a suitcase and found my soul unraveling. I used to be a property manager in London back in the 80s. For one reason or another, the flats I managed weren't strictly legal. So, it was basically my job to collect rent, arrange repairs, and be a buffer between the real owner and the council should they ever find out he was flouting regulations. It was a proper cash under the table sort of thing, and we didn't discriminate when it came to tenants. If you could give us the month's rent, which was about 60 quid back then we'd give you a bedroom in a shared house with communal kitchen and bathroom facilities. These days, a lot of landlords ask foreigners for proof of their right to be in the country. And I think you can get into trouble if you're found to be housing illegal immigrants. But back then, we weren't in the least bit interested in who you were or where you were from. All we wanted was money. And the same applied when I met a guy called Yuri. Yuri mentioned something about being from Latvia, but I never saw any papers to confirm that. His name could have been anything, and he could have been from anywhere. I met him outside this crumbling down house in Finsbury, one of the properties that I managed. Heavy emphasis on those quotation marks there. Yuri wasn't like the usual tenants, the ones that looked over their shoulders or reeked of trouble. He stood tall, calm, as if he'd already seen the worst this world could throw at him. I remember the way he looked at the house, not with disgust, not with hope, just acceptance, like he'd lived in worse and expected nothing better. The room he rented was barely more than a closet with mold problems and a window that whined in the wind. The wallpaper peeled like skin from a burn. The floorboards sighed in agony. But Yuri just nodded and handed me the cash. "Won't need anything," he said. "I work long hours." The room that he was after was a mess. There was peeling wallpaper, damp patches everywhere, and a stink that was sort of half mold and half despair. It was the kind of place that you'd give a rat the hump, and Yuri didn't quite seem desperate enough to rent it. But after a brief look around, he told me he'd take it. I was surprised, honestly, but I wasn't about to argue with the man. I just took his money, gave him his keys, and that was that. Every month, Yuri followed the same ritual. Leave rent in the pillowcase, scribble a short note, disappear like smoke before I arrived. It was almost comforting, that predictability, like some ancient rhythm in a business full of chaos. Next month, when I went around to collect the rent, Yuri wasn't in. He cleaned the place up quite nicely, gotten rid of all the mold and the peeling wallpaper, and he left a little note on his bed that just said, "Busy at work, money in pillowcase." We dealt with some quite unsavory characters on a regular basis, and I'd had someone try and run a scam like that on me before. As they say, if you play with feathers, you get your arse tickled. But Yuri wasn't like the others. When I reached into the pillowcase, "Bob's your uncle," the cash was there. Every time. I should have known peace never lasts. Not in this line of work. And certainly not with a man like Yuri. Too quiet. Too clean. Too good at disappearing. The 6th month was different. No rent. No note. No Yuri. The house was unusually quiet that day. Not the kind of quiet you hope for in a home, but the kind that feels like something's watching. Waiting. I remember climbing the creaking stairs of the Finsbury house, the smell of dust and stale air clinging to my clothes. I knocked on Yuri's door, out of habit more than anything else. So, I knocked on Yuri's door just out of habit, really. And when there was no answer, as per usual, I just pushed it open. His room was just the same as ever. Bare except a single bed, a rickety old chair, and a wardrobe that was well on its last legs. I went for the pillowcase, expecting to find the cash in the usual place, but there was nothing. I patted it down and shook it a bit, but still nothing fell out. I remember standing there with that pillow in my hands, frozen. The silence grew heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. That wasn't like Yuri at all. He'd only been renting about 6 months, but he'd always paid on time and in the same fashion. Good as gold. Then I opened the old wardrobe to see if his clothes were still there, and saw they were all gone. It was completely gutted. No clothes, no personal items, no note, just a suitcase, shoved halfway under the bed. The kind of suitcase that doesn't belong to anyone anymore. It looked wrong. Bulging at the sides, beaten up around the edges, and it stank. Not just mildew, something raw, rotten. I hardly ever found a reliable tenant like him. Not in our game, so it always stung a bit whenever they decided to move someplace else. I was about to leave, and I was right on my way out the door when I spotted something under the bed. It was a suitcase, brown leather and bashed up around the edges. I'm not one for poking my nose in where it doesn't belong, but something didn't feel right. All of Yuri's stuff was gone, and he hadn't left any rent money either. So, what was his suitcase doing under his bed? I thought for a second, then said to myself, "Stuff it. I'll have a quick look and see if there's a note or something." I walked back in, shut the door, kneeled down next to the bed, and pulled out the suitcase. My fingers hesitated on the latch. Something in me screamed to leave it alone, but I opened it anyway. I flicked the latch, lifted the lid, and my heart stopped. There was Yuri inside the suitcase, his body all twisted up and broken, like someone had to fold him up to fit him inside. His arms looked snapped and bent at odd angles, while his legs were tucked under him backwards. His face was all gray, and his eyes were wide open, staring out blankly. He didn't look peaceful. He didn't look like he had died quickly. He looked like he had been stuffed away, like trash, like a secret. There was nothing else. Just him, stuffed inside like he was something to be thrown away. I got up and stumbled back, hand clamped over my mouth to keep the smell out of my nose, but I still felt sick. The room started spinning, and the next thing I'm out the door and taking the stairs 2 at a time. I burst out into the street. The sunlight felt alien, like it had no business shining when something so awful had just been uncovered. I pulled the front door open, ran out into the street before I stopped. I remember how my hand shook as I fumbled for my pack of cigarettes. I lit one and took a long drag, but it did nothing to calm me down. And as I paced back and forth outside the house, I wondered what the hell was I going to do. I was no saint, but I wasn't a body disposal guy either. I should have walked straight to the police, but instead, I made the worst call of my life. I stood outside that crumbling house in Finsbury, chain-smoking cigarettes like they were prayers. Each drag burned down my throat, but it couldn't burn away what I'd just seen. A man, someone I'd spoken to, taken rent from, was folded like discarded laundry in a bloody suitcase under a bed I helped him rent. I knew I couldn't just walk into a police station. Not yet. Not with the people I worked for. At the time, I knew the owner of the property, a man who will remain nameless, was quite an active figure in London's criminal underworld. I just didn't know to what extent. That meant that he'd probably go mental if I just phoned the police and invited them into one of his gaffes. But this wasn't just a broken window or a tenant who wouldn't pay up. This was a goddamn body. I needed to call him, not because I trusted him, but because I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't. Payphone. Street corner. Fingers shaking. I slid coins in like they were loaded bullets and dialed the number only the trusted few were given. His missus picked up first, a voice like cold tea. She didn't ask questions, just passed the phone. Then the man himself, calm, too calm. I didn't say body. I said, "We've got something left behind in Finsbury. Real quiet. Needs handling." I dug out a few coins from my pocket and walked to the phone box around the corner. And from there, I rang the owner, the cig burning down my fingers as I dialed his number. His missus picked up the phone, handed it over to him. Then I told him all about the body in the suitcase. I obviously didn't just come out and say it, not over the phone. But we had a way of talking back then where you said things without saying them. Once he'd gotten to the gist of it, I thought that the owner was going to flip his lid. But instead, he stayed calm. A bit too calm under the circumstances, and asked me if I was sure the tenant had departed. When I told him I was sure, his eggs is eggs. He told me not to involve anyone else, and asked where the tenant was right now. Then, when I told him, he asked me to help the tenant move out. Help him move out? The way he said it chilled me. Like I was being told to take out the garbage, I told him, firmly. Not a chance. This is murder. I'm calling the police. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He just hung up. That silence told me everything I needed to know. Then, before I could argue further, he hung up. Until that day, all I knew about the owner of the shared house was that he was involved in renting flats. Well, dodgy ones at that. I might have been a bit of a geyser back then, but I wasn't stupid. And what he said on that phone clued me into the fact that whatever else he was involved in, it was a lot more illegal than just some dodgy flat shares. I stood there in that phone box for what felt like hours. The receiver hung loose in my hand. I wasn't just a property manager anymore. I was now a liability. He knew where I lived. He knew my mum's place, my sister's work, my best mate's pub, and more than that, my prints were on the suitcase. If I didn't get ahead of it, I wasn't a witness. I was an accomplice. My heart was pounding after that phone call, my head spinning with all kinds of frightening realizations. For the past God knows how long, I've been working for someone who was now casually telling me to dispose of a body like it was nothing. This was more than just being some dodgy landlord. You'd have to be a real dark kind of person not to even flinch at something like this. But this guy knew my name, my family's names, where I live, everything. But at the same time, my fingerprints were on that suitcase, and if I didn't get out ahead of it and tell the coppers that all I'd done was stumble across it, then there was a good chance that I'd be going down for something, maybe even murder. That was the moment I made the call that really mattered. Not to the boss, not to a cleaner, to the police, because if I didn't, I was already dead in someone else's trunk. The phone box stank of piss and regret, but I stood there dialing 9999 like it was my last hope. My hand trembled so much I almost missed the numbers. But when the dispatcher answered, I forced myself to speak clearly. There's a body, in a suitcase. Top floor, 42 Primrose House, Finsbury. I didn't say my name. I didn't need to. They'd find it out anyway. And I wanted them to, because if I didn't step forward, I'd be dragged down with Yuri into a silence even deeper than that old suitcase. I rang the police from a payphone, gave them the address, led them to the suitcase, told them what I found and how I found it. They said I'd done the right thing, but I knew that as soon as my boss got wind that I'd been talking to the police, I'd be in deep doo-doo. I went back to the house. Not inside, just outside. Waiting. Police sirens wailing down the road like Judgment Day. 2 cops stepped out of a Panda car, uniforms crisp, faces already hardened against whatever they were about to see. I waved them over. "I'll show you the room," I said, the moment they opened that suitcase. Their expressions didn't change, but their eyes did. That tells you everything about a man. These weren't rookies. but even they weren't ready for what they saw. Soon after, the forensics team arrived. White suits, masks, cameras flashing. Yuri's body, if you could still call it a body, was gently zipped into a second, larger bag. One of the officers looked at me and said, "You did the right thing," but it didn't feel right. It felt like I'd just drawn a target on my back. That night, I crashed at my mate Dave's place over in Camden. I couldn't go back to my own flat. It'd be too risky. So, he gave me a place to sleep for the night. I didn't sleep. Just stared at the ceiling. Every blink was another glimpse of Yuri's broken limbs. Every breath tasted like old leather and rot. The walls felt too thin, the night too long. The next day, news traveled fast. A friend of mine from another property said, "Oi, your boss is looking for you. Pissed, real quiet about it, but looking." Then Dave told me, "Some blokes came asking for you. Didn't say who they were, just that they needed a chat." The next day, I heard word had gotten back to my boss, or by then my former boss, that Yuri's body was with the coroner and that the police were talking to the tenants in the house that he owned. Assuming that was true, my former boss had almost certainly sent people out looking for me. My mom lived 2 neighborhoods away, alone, retired. I didn't think twice. Grabbed a backpack, took the train to hers. When she opened the door, I didn't even say hello. "We need to go," I told her. "Now." She blinked. "What's this about?" And I told her everything. So, I asked Dave if I could lie low at his place for a few days, until it was safe to return to my flat to grab my stuff. He said that was fine, but I didn't exactly tell him the whole story. If I had, I'm not sure that he'd have let me stay. I didn't go out at all, and Dave definitely knew something was up, but he didn't ask questions. I just kind of hung out on the couch drinking his lager and wondering if I was going to end up moving to Brighton, Birmingham, or maybe even Manchester. But hiding wasn't going to be enough. They knew my name, my flat, my mum. If I stayed still, they'd find me. If I ran, maybe I'd have a chance. That night, I returned to my flat in the middle of the night to grab my things. But what I found there wasn't just broken furniture. It was a message. The hallway smelled different before I even stepped inside. Something was off. The kind of off that makes the hair on your arms rise before your mind catches up. The lock looked untouched, but when I pushed the door, it creaked open without resistance. That door was locked when I left. But when I got there, the place had been trashed. Whoever my boss had sent had done something to the lock, because it didn't look like anything was wrong until I tried to put my key in the door, and it creaked open from the force inside. My flat looked like a bomb had hit it. Everything was overturned, sofa slashed, curtains ripped, records shattered on the floor. But it was the smell that stopped me in my tracks. Urine, not animal, human. They'd pissed all over my clothes. They'd smashed my telephone, ripped up my sofa, broken all my records. And from the smell of the bedroom, they'd gone to the toilet all over my clothes. I didn't take anything with me. There was really nothing to take. They hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't searched for anything. They came here to tell me one thing: "We can reach you anytime we want." I stood in the middle of the wreckage, breathing hard, eyes darting. It wasn't just intimidation. It was ownership. They wanted me to know I didn't own my life anymore. Not unless I did something. Fast. I turned around, left everything behind. No bags, no souvenirs. Just one thought in my mind: get to Mom, get her out. The only thing that mattered was getting to my mom's, and then getting her on a coach to Manchester. The furthest of my options before anything happened to her. 2 guys had already been over asking where I was, so she knew that I was in some sort of trouble. But it still took some convincing to get my mom to pack a bag. She didn't ask too many questions. Maybe she saw something in my face. Maybe she knew the kind of man her son had been working for. We packed light, no phone calls, no goodbyes, just coats and cash. She didn't know how I made my money, so I had to spill the beans on her son being a bit of a naughty boy before she understood how serious things were. I told her the men looking for me were bad people, and that the next time they darkened her door, they might hurt her as a way of getting to me. The next morning, we boarded a coach headed north. Rain tapped against the windows as London faded behind us. Each mile was a little lighter, a little safer, or so I thought. The next day, me and Mom were in a B&B up in Manchester. I had a few quid in my pocket, so I found us both places to stay quite quickly. And then after that, it was a case of trying to go straight and earn an honest living for the first time in my life. That first week, didn't sleep. Every footstep outside made me reach for something sharp. Mom tried to cook like everything was normal, but nothing was normal anymore. I had found a body in a suitcase. I had been told to make it disappear, and now I was on the run. From men I used to work for, and maybe from myself too. I kept wondering if they'd come to Manchester, to me, or worse, to Mom, but they never did. Only the nightmares came. Some nights in Manchester were quieter than London ever allowed, but silence can be cruel when your mind won't shut up. I'd lie there on the thin mattress in the B&B, staring at the ceiling, my eyes refusing to close. And when they did, I dreamed I was back in that room. The stench of damp, the light flickering, the suitcase slowly creaking open on its own. And inside wasn't Yuri this time, it was me. I was folded up, arms snapped, knees to chest, my own eyes staring wide at nothing. And worse than the dream was waking up thinking, someone was zipping it closed. No one ever found us. But at night, the nightmares did. I dreamed that someone was zipping me into a suitcase and then shoving me under a bed. And I'd wake up scared, thinking someone was at the door. But no one ever was. It was just my imagination. But was it? Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside the window, a cough in the hallway that stopped too quickly. I told myself it was paranoia, trauma, but part of me wondered, were they watching? Waiting? Days turned to weeks. Mom started talking about going home. She missed her garden, her kettle, the cat. I didn't tell her the nightmares had stopped being about me. They were about Yuri now, except sometimes. He blinked. Sometimes I wonder if the cops ever got anywhere with Yuri's murder. I doubt it, but I also don't think that it was my former boss that had anything to do with it either. He just wanted me to get rid of the suitcase. I kept going back to that scene. Yuri's limbs twisted like pipe cleaners. The look in his eyes, not just pain, surprise, maybe even betrayal. He hadn't expected whoever killed him, which meant it wasn't some random thug. It was someone he let get close. That thought made my stomach churn. Who could overpower a man like Yuri? Who could bend him like that? And stuff him into a suitcase like laundry? It wasn't just physical strength. It was methodical, intentional. I remembered the boss's voice. Help him move out. No flinch, no reaction. Like this wasn't the first time, but it couldn't have been him. He wouldn't use someone like me for cleanup. He'd have used someone darker, someone colder. And if for some reason he had wanted Yuri dead, then he'd surely have given the job to someone more cold-blooded and reliable than myself. So, who? Yuri wasn't involved in any scams. He didn't argue with housemates. He didn't owe anyone money. He worked, he paid, he vanished. No. I think someone else put Yuri in that suitcase. I don't know why, but I know they'd have to be pretty scary to be able to best a 6-foot barrel-chested Eastern European guy like Yuri. I stopped trying to figure it out after a while, not because I didn't care, but because deep down, I was afraid I'd find the answer. And once I did, I'd have to do something about it. Manchester had gray skies and slow mornings, a place where things felt suspended, as if time wasn't quite sure whether to move forward or freeze forever. It was the perfect place to disappear. I found a job moving boxes in a warehouse near the canals. Paid in cash. No paperwork. The kind of job you take when you don't want anyone asking questions. I shaved the beard, changed my name on the clock-in sheet. No one called me landlord anymore. Mom found part-time work at a bakery. said it helped with her nerves. She still flinched every time a van parked outside too long. I never asked how many nightmares she had, because I had enough for both of us. But slowly, life started to stitch itself back together. We moved out of the B&B and into a small flat above a butcher's shop. Smelled like sausage at 6 a.m., but the walls were thick. I bought a kettle. Mom planted herbs in the windowsill. We almost felt normal. Then one morning, I opened the mailbox. Inside was an envelope. No name, no return address. Just one thing inside, a photograph. It was Yuri, taken from across the street, blurry, but unmistakable. The timestamp on the corner, 2 days before he died. I dropped the photo, my heart hammered. Who took that picture? Why send it to me? And what message were they trying to send? That they were watching me? Or that they knew I was watching them back? That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of dreams, but because I spent the whole night at the window, staring at the street. These days, I have a whole new section added to my rental agreements, all about the use of volatile or flammable chemicals within the apartment complex. Some potential tenants, while reading it though, have said things to me like, "Wow, what a weird thing to have to write into a rental agreement." And I tell them that I've seen everything in my years as a landlord, and I imagine I sometimes smile when I say it, too. But I don't imagine that smile reaches my eyes at all. I didn't know why the memory of that suitcase returned just then, but it came back with a vengeance. The zipper's hiss, the way Yuri's knees had been bent backwards, the silence in the room as I stepped back. I thought I could outrun it. But memories don't need passports. I started thinking again about the killer, the motive, the message. Why Yuri? Why that method? And why me? Why leave the body in my building? Knowing I'd find it, I called the detective I'd spoken to that day, asked if they ever made progress. He paused. "Not much," he said. "But we still have questions." I didn't ask what they were, because I had questions of my own. I started asking around. Not too loud, not too often, just enough. The Eastern European lads at the warehouse, the ones who kept to themselves, started opening up when I bought them a few pints. "Latvia?" one said. "No one from Riga would say they're from Latvia. That's how outsiders pronounce it." That stuck with me. Yuri had never quite answered my questions directly. He told me what I needed to hear, just enough to rent a room. No more. Had I ever actually seen him go to work? He always said he worked long hours, night shifts, but I couldn't remember once seeing him leave in the morning or come home late. Maybe I never paid enough attention, or maybe that was the point. His name could have been anything, and he could have been from anywhere. That sentence echoed in my mind like a warning I ignored. So I started digging, quietly, carefully. Old rent ledgers, names of passive tenants. Yuri wasn't the first to vanish. He was just the first one to leave his body behind. Once a name jumped out at me. Milosh. Paid on time, never complained, stayed 6 months, then gone. No forwarding address, no calls, nothing. Just like Yuri. I went back to the detective, told him what I found. He wasn't surprised. "You're not the only one who's been looking," he said. Then he handed me something, a photocopy of a report, a different case, different name, but the same ending, a suitcase, a body, folded wrong, eyes wide open. Suddenly, I saw Yuri differently. Was he running from something or toward it? Had he been hiding in that room or baiting someone? He didn't seem desperate enough to rent it. But after a brief look around, he told me he'd take it. That line haunted me. Why would a man like him accept a place that bad? Unless he wasn't planning on staying long. I started dreaming again. This time, Yuri was standing at the foot of my bed, whispering something in a language I couldn't understand. His mouth didn't move, but I could hear it. "You brought me here." I woke up soaked in sweat, hands clenched. I needed answers, or closure, but I wasn't sure I wanted either, because the deeper I went, the more I feared I wasn't just a witness to a murder. I might have been the final step of someone else's plan. The envelope was hand-delivered. No stamp, no sender, just my name. Spelled wrong. That chilled me more than if it had been exact, because only someone watching from afar would get that detail just slightly off. Inside, a note. Printed, not handwritten. It wasn't random. Check the basement of 42 Primrose. You missed something. No signature. Just that one sentence. I stared at the words for hours. Why now? Why reach out? And who was you? A witness? An accomplice? Or the one who folded Yuri? I tried to ignore it. But curiosity is a curse when you've seen a body in a suitcase. I packed a bag. Told my mom I'd be back in a day or two. Didn't tell her why. I took the train back to London. The city felt smaller, darker, like it had aged while I was gone. I stood outside 42 Primrose again. Paint still flaked from the windows. The same broken buzzer, the same cold bricks. It looked just like before, but it felt entirely different now. I walked back in, shut the door, kneeled down next to the bed, and pulled out the suitcase. I flicked the latch, lifted the lid, and my heart stopped. That memory flashed again. I shoved it down. This wasn't about the past. This was about finding what I'd missed. The basement was locked, but I still had a key. Old habits. The hallway smelled of mildew and secrets. Water dripped somewhere in the dark. I turned on my torch. Dust, cobwebs, forgotten paint cans. And then, behind a broken boiler, another suitcase. Smaller, newer. Inside, papers, names. Photo. One of them was me. Another was Yuri. Another was Milosh. It was a ledger. A hit list. Coded and shuffled, but obvious in its intent. And all of them had the same marker. Room 3C, 6 months. Each stayed exactly 6 months. Each vanished after. I flipped the last page, and there was a new name. Mine. With a date, 1 month from now. I dropped the book. My hands went numb. This wasn't about Yuri. It was about me. It had always been about me. I stumbled out of the basement like a man pulled from the grave. The file in my hand felt heavier than lead. My name. My date. Room 3C. I had walked into someone else's ritual. A system. A cycle. And I was next in line. He was reliable as anyone was. Old Yuri. But then came the month when… Well, you'll see what I mean in a moment. Won't you? It was a grim Tuesday lunchtime. All gray and dreary out when I drove over to the house in Finsbury to collect the rent. Yuri hadn't just picked that room. He had been assigned to it. And me? Maybe I had been part of the pattern all along. The landlord who always came. The land to see them alive. I ran, not from the house, but from the idea that I'd let it happen again. I took the documents to the police. They didn't believe me at first, but I handed over names, patterns, evidence. One officer, an older one, stared at me for a long time before saying, "You might have just blown open something big." I didn't care about the headlines. I just wanted it to stop. It didn't. 2 weeks later, the flat above the butcher shop was broken into. Nothing stolen. But on my bed was a suitcase. Empty. Clean. But folded inside was one photograph. Yuri, smiling. And to twist him up like that. To snap his arms and legs and fold him in half. It takes a very frightening person to do something like that. A person I'm very glad I never had to meet. But maybe I already had. Or worse, maybe I had become that person in someone else's story. Mom left for Ireland the next morning. I didn't argue. I packed up, burned the photo, moved again. Different name, different job. But I never stayed longer than 6 months. Because sometimes I see suitcases in the corner of my eye, where none exist. Sometimes I hear Yuri whisper in my sleep. Sometimes I dream that I never found that body. And then I wake up screaming. Because I realize I never left the room. The meat sculpture in apartment 4. If you ever hear buzzing behind a locked door, don't open it. Sometimes the dead don't rest. Not because of ghosts, but because of what you left behind. You think nightmares can't walk into the daylight? I saw one in apartment 4. There are things worse than bodies. Things built to look like them. And when the smell hits you before the door opens, it's already too late. Back in the late 80s, I was slinging keys as a landlord here in New York City, managing a couple of walk-ups over in the East Village. They weren't fancy, just a couple of crumbly brick buildings with tenants who paid late and pipes that groaned louder than a drunk on St. Paddy's. I had some real crazy tenants from time to time. Not all of them were bad. There were some good ones, don't get me wrong, but out of the bad bunch, the worst guy was the one in apartment 4, because sometimes what happened there still crawls into my head at night. I got the call one summer afternoon. Heat clung to the walls like sweat, and the air conditioning in my office, wedged behind an old Polish deli, had long since given up. The phone rang, sharp and sudden, and the woman on the line had a voice like honey, strained but polite. She asked if I knew an Albert Russo, said he was her uncle, lived on East 10th. I didn't even have to think. That was Al, kept to himself, paid rent on time, always in a plain envelope slipped under the door. Quiet guy, probably in his mid-60s. I confirmed he lived there and asked who she was. Clara, she said. His niece. I haven't heard from him in weeks. She didn't want to call the cops just yet. Worried they'd bust the door down just to find a disconnected phone or a cat knocking things over. She hoped I could help her check first. I wish I had said no. I met Clara later that day outside the building. She was mid-30s, blonde, dressed like someone who planned to go home clean. She smiled politely, but her eyes kept flinching toward the door. We climbed the stairs together, tension rising with every creaking step. When we reached the door of apartment 4, I knocked. "Hey, yo, Al, it's me, Tony, open up." No answer. Knocked again, louder. Nothing. Clara clutched her purse tighter. I pulled out the key, and her breath caught when it clicked in the lock. I pushed the door open, only a crack, and the smell hit us. It was preternatural, like rot, vinegar, old meat, and something metallic. We gagged, both of us. She backed into the hallway, sleeve pressed to her face. I covered my mouth and stepped inside. The apartment was dark. Curtains sealed out the sun, like someone didn't want the world to see inside. I fumbled for the light. I wish I hadn't. Trash everywhere. Mold crusted the edges of dishes in the sink. Flies buzzed like a motor over rotting food. The smell had a pulse. Clara pointed to the half-closed bedroom door. I nodded. Every step felt like moving through wet cement. The hallway narrowed around me. The air turned syrup thick. I pushed open the door. I stopped, and for a second, my brain refused to understand what I saw. A lump on the bed, human-shaped, covered in a stained sheet. Flies swarmed over it, dipping in and out like it was alive in its own way. Clara gasped behind me. I don't know what made me do it. Curiosity? Stupidity? I stepped forward and peeled the sheet back. And God help me, I wish I hadn't. There's something wrong when even the flies seem organized. I've smelled death before. This wasn't it. It was worse. It was trying to imitate it. The body didn't rot like a man. It rotted like a message. The figure beneath the sheet had a human silhouette. Arms, legs, a torso. But everything else was wrong. The skin was bloated and torn in places, like overripe fruit left in the sun. Flies poured from the splits, black and shiny, crawling over one another in frenzy. But the worst were the eyes, or rather, where the eyes should have been. Just black, caved-in holes. I stumbled back. Clara didn't even scream. She just ran. I heard her heels pounding the stairs, heard the door to the building slam open, and then silence. Except for the flies. I followed her down, lungs heaving, stomach threatening to empty on the sidewalk. She was outside, sobbing into her hands. I wanted to say something, anything, but the only words that came out were, Stay here. I ran for a payphone. My fingers shook so hard I dropped the coin twice. When the operator picked up, I all but shouted, "There's a body. Please, apartment 4 on East 10th. It smells… God, it smells like it's been there for days." The cops came fast. 2 of them. Gruff and built like they wrestled perps for breakfast. One took a whiff inside and cursed, hand over his nose. "Another damn demp," I heard one mutter, whatever that meant. The EMTs arrived next. They smeared Vaseline under their noses before going in. A trick I wish I'd known. Clara and I waited outside, the buzzing in my ears now matched by the buzzing from the flies. 15 minutes passed, then 30. That's when it started to feel off. One of the paramedics came down. Short guy, thick glasses, pale like he hadn't seen sun in months. He looked shaken. I mean, really shaken, like he'd seen a war crime. "You the landlord?" he asked. I nodded. He looked at Clara, then back at me, and said quietly, "That thing on the bed, it's not human." Clara gasped. "What do you mean, not human?" He shook his head. "I mean, I don't know what it is. You'll have to wait for forensics." Her relief was almost instant. If it wasn't human, it couldn't be her uncle. But her joy died fast. I think deep down, she knew this wasn't good news. Because if it wasn't her uncle, where the hell was he? The building filled up with crime scene guys soon after. White suits, cameras, tape. Some of them looked nauseous even from the hallway. One dropped something on his way out, a small scalpel. His hands were shaking so hard he couldn't pick it up. They searched the apartment top to bottom. Most of it was trash and decay. But one of the officers opened the freezer and swore. He called another guy over, then a third. Eventually, a cop came down and told me gently to take Clara home. They'd call. Of course, I didn't take her home. I walked her to the train station. She didn't say much, just stared straight ahead, like she was watching something nobody else could see. Weeks passed, and then the call came. The voice on the other end belonged to a detective. Sounded like someone who thought he'd seen everything. He hadn't. They told me it wasn't a body. They were wrong. It was worse than a body. It was a message carved in meat. Some people leave letters, some leave voicemails. Al left. That. When the detective called, I expected closure. Instead, I got a deeper nightmare. His tone was heavy, like someone bracing for impact. "We got the lab results," he said. "You're going to want to sit down." I was already sitting, but the way my spine stiffened, it felt like falling anyway. "That thing in the bed wasn't your tenant," he said. I already knew that much. Then what was it? Silence. Then, animal parts, stitched together to resemble a human corpse. I didn't say anything. Couldn't. The words just clanged around my skull, unable to settle. He continued, each phrase colder than the last. Various species. Pigeons, rats, raccoons, some stray cats, dogs, too. Musculature, arranged to mimic human proportions. Bones inserted to support the limbs. Internal organs, unclear if arranged for realism or simply stuffed. It had been wired together with thin lengths of steel. Some bones were drilled through. Some flesh had been shaped, pressed, folded. A sculpture, a thing made to fool the eye in a dimly lit room. But not forever. Eventually, the illusion broke down into rot and horror. They found meat stored in the freezer. Nothing labeled, of course. Just bundles of animal parts, bagged and frozen. The bottom drawer, they said, was overflowing, and some of the meat had been skinned. Cooked? They couldn't tell. Or maybe they didn't want to say. When I asked if there was any sign of Albert, the detective paused. No trace, no fingerprints, no blood linked to him. It's like he vanished into thin air. That wasn't the worst part. What chilled me to the bone was this. They'd searched for him. Hospitals, morgues, psychiatric wards. They even dragged a portion of the East River, put his name in missing persons, scanned dental records. Nothing. Albert Russo, as far as the city was concerned, had ceased to exist. I kept in touch with Clara for a while after that. I guess we both needed the connection, even if it was built on something neither of us wanted to revisit. She never found anything. No sightings, no letters, no fingerprints on the sculpture, no signs he had even left the building that day. And yet, there was no proof he had died, just the absence of a man and the presence of something else. I began to wonder if Clara knew more than she admitted. Something in the way she reacted, not just fear, but recognition. A slow, creeping confirmation, like a part of her had always expected to find something awful. Maybe she'd heard stories from the family. Maybe Uncle Al wasn't always quiet and kind. Maybe quiet was just the outer layer. One night I got drunk and started going through the old files. Tenant records, maintenance logs, scribbled notes. Al had never submitted a complaint. Not once. Not about plumbing. Not about heat in the winter. Nothing. Most tenants at least wanted something. But Al, he just existed, like a shadow you only notice when it's gone. There was one photo. Just one. It had slipped behind a folder. An old Christmas potluck we had one year for the tenants. I stared at the grainy image for a long time. Everyone was smiling, holding paper plates. But Al? He stood at the very back, eyes slightly off-center, like he was watching something behind the photographer, or listening to something. Only he could hear. I couldn't sleep that night. And that was the first time I dreamed of the thing in the bed. Not as parts, but as something alive. Something breathing slowly beneath the sheet. Waiting, watching, and in the dream, it turned its head. It didn't have a face, just a fold of stitched skin, but it smiled. There are things the body remembers, even when the mind denies. The smell, the heat, the silence after the scream. If what we saw was made to look human, what was it made for? I started dreaming about apartment 4 more often. At first it was just the hallway, then the smell, then the moment the door opened. But in the dreams, there was no Clara, just me, alone. And the thing on the bed always sat up. Woke up drenched in sweat more times than I can count. I thought maybe it was guilt. Maybe I should have seen the signs. Or maybe I was cursed with the memory of it now. The way some buildings breathe after you leave them. I'd walk past that old place and feel the hairs on my arms rise, even boarded up. Apartment 4 had a pulse. A year passed. Clara stopped picking up the phone. I don't blame her. What else was there to say? But the last time we spoke, she told me something I've never forgotten. I had a dream, she whispered. I was in his apartment, except it wasn't his apartment. Everything was in reverse. The fridge was on the wrong wall. The bathroom led to a staircase. And when I opened the bedroom door, he was there, sitting up in bed. But he didn't have a face. She paused. But he spoke? What did he say? I asked. She didn't answer. She just said, I woke up with the smell in my nose. I started reading about things I never would have considered before. Urban legends, occult rituals, meat sculptures, a niche community, believe it or not. Artists who use decay, decomposition, even taxidermy to challenge perceptions of the body. But what Al made, that wasn't art. It was functional. That was the word that kept coming back to me. Functional, like it had a purpose. But for what? There were rumors, always are. A dog walker swore she saw Al weeks after he disappeared, standing near the East River, feeding pigeons, not saying a word. A maintenance guy said he heard sounds in the walls of the building, like chewing, he told me. Big chewing. One guy, a mailman, told me something I'll never forget. I used to deliver there every Tuesday. Al was always nice, but near the end, I stopped seeing him. Then one day, I thought I saw him, on the stairs, heading down, except he had a limp. A weird limp, like his foot was backwards. I tried to laugh it off, tell myself it was just paranoia. But even years later, that building never got another tenant in apartment 4. No one wanted it, even after repainting, cleaning, gutting the interior. Tenants refused to move in. Some swore it smelled wrong. Others said they heard buzzing from the vents. One girl fainted during a viewing, said she saw someone lying on the bed, even though the room was empty. Eventually, I stopped renting it out, boarded it up, pretended it never existed. But sometimes, when I dream and I open that door, the thing on the bed isn't a sculpture anymore. It's breathing, waiting, and I think maybe it never needed Al's body, just his absence. The city's full of missing people, but not all of them are gone. Some of them are hiding, in plain sight. If you build something in the shape of a man and fill it with meat and wire, does it ever become one? I should have let it go. Sold the building, burned the records, washed my hands of the whole thing. But curiosity is a kind of rot, too. It eats from the inside. A year and a half after the incident, I made the mistake of digging deeper. It started with a name, Dr. Simon Verne, a forensic anthropologist. He'd been one of the white suit guys at the scene back then. He was the one who told me the thing on the bed wasn't human. I'd never forgotten the look on his face, like he'd touched something wrong. And now it lived under his skin. After a long trail of dead emails, I finally reached him by phone. He didn't want to talk, said he'd signed papers, said it was sealed, said I should forget it. Then, quietly, he said something that froze me. The parts were too fresh. What do you mean? They were stitched recently, hours before discovery. But no blood, no signs of struggle. And the wounds, they healed. I didn't know what to say. He hung up soon after. Never replied again. But I knew what I heard. The wounds healed. Then came the second name. C. Danziger, a janitor who used to work in the same precinct where Al's case was filed. Through a guy I knew at the deli, I managed to track her down, bought her lunch, tried to play it casual. But she knew exactly what I was asking about the moment I said East 10th. Her hands trembled. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They locked that case, sealed it up tight. But I saw the photos. She looked me straight in the eyes. That wasn't taxidermy. It was growing. Something twisted in my stomach. How do you mean? She pulled out a crumpled napkin and started drawing. Shaky lines. A figure on a bed. Thick, dark shapes around the neck and spine. Roots, she said. Like nerve clusters, but branching out. As if the sculpture was trying to integrate. To what? To something that used to be human. That night, I drank too much and dreamed too deep. This time, I wasn't in apartment 4. I was underground. In a tunnel, there were walls of meat, stitched, pulsing, faces carved into them, all expressionless. My footsteps echoed like wet slaps, and at the end of the tunnel was a door, old, rusted, and behind it, I heard breathing. But not just one breath, hundreds, maybe thousands, all in sync. I woke up screaming. The next day, I went back to the building, just stood in front of it, heart pounding. It was cold, windy, the kind of gray afternoon where the sky looks like it's trying to warn you. I wasn't going to go inside. That was never the plan. But something changed. I heard buzzing, not from the street, not from trash, from the second floor window. From apartment 4, not every door is meant to be opened. Some are warnings, others, invitations. He didn't disappear. He evolved. I stood outside the building for what felt like an hour. The buzzing wouldn't stop. It wasn't loud. It was constant, like a distant engine. But pulsing, organic, coming from inside apartment 4. I knew it was boarded up. I had locked the place myself. But something in that sound reached into my ribs and pressed. So I went in. The staircase was darker than I remembered. Dust clung to the railing. The hallway smelled faintly of vinegar and copper. I reached apartment 4 and froze. The door was open, just slightly. Not wide, not inviting. Waiting, I pushed it open. The air inside was warm, too warm, like the inside of a mouth. I half expected the furniture to be gone, but no, it was exactly the same. Even the bed was still there, but now, the buzzing had a direction. It was coming from inside the walls. I stepped in, heart pounding, sweat already slick on my back. There were footprints on the dusty floor. Bare, human. Leading from the door to the kitchen, then toward the bedroom. They weren't mine. I followed them, and when I reached the doorway, I stopped. Not because I was scared, though I was, but because something was already standing there. It looked like a man, wearing clothes that might have once fit Albert Russo, but they were stretched over something else. Something taller, broader, like a scarecrow made of meat and bone. The face was his, but wrong. The skin was too tight, the jaw wider than it should be. The eyes weren't eyes at all, just black pits with something moving inside. He turned slowly, no sudden motion, no threat, just presence. And then, he spoke. "You saw it," he said. His voice was low, wet, like it gurgled through lungs made of different animals. I didn't respond. "You were the first to see what I made," he continued. "The first to recognize the shape." I couldn't breathe. "What are you?" I finally whispered. "Albert." The thing that had once been Albert tilted its head. I was the vessel. Now I am the mold. Behind him, the walls began to twitch. At first I thought it was my eyes adjusting. But no, they pulsed, moved. Faces, half-formed. Some animal, some human, stitched into the plaster like frescoes of flesh. I staggered back. "You didn't bring the police," he said. "You brought her, Clara, his niece." "You knew," I whispered. He nodded. "She left the seed. I only needed time to grow." Then he stepped aside, revealing the bed, and on it, a new sculpture. But this one wasn't made from rats or pigeons. It was made from her. I ran, didn't look back, didn't stop until I was blocks away, didn't tell the cops, didn't write it down, didn't breathe a word, until now. The building was condemned last year. Fire, they said. No survivors, but I saw the footage. And in one of the final frames, through the smoke, you can still see a figure standing in the window, smiling. So if you ever hear buzzing, don't open the door, because what's behind it might not be waiting to be found. It might be waiting to finish growing. The tenant in 2B burned the bathtub. He told me it was just research. But when I saw the bathtub, scorched, silent, human-shaped, I realized something had burned through more than just skin. There were no flames, no smoke, no ash, just a smell that clung to the soul and wouldn't let go. He tried to restructure matter, but what if something restructured him first? I've seen tenants come and go, but no one ever truly leaves apartment 2B. Rules aren't always written in ink. Some are written in fire and in blood. I've been a landlord in San Francisco for damn near 40 years, long enough to see every kind of tenant you can imagine. Hippies, tech bros, deadbeats, you name it. I'm just a working class guy, born and raised in the Mission, scraping by on the rent from a couple of old apartment buildings. They're not much, but they've been enough to keep me afloat. Most tenants come and go without fanfare. Some leave behind unpaid rent, others a stained couch or a mystery smell I'd rather not solve. But James? James was different. He showed up in 1989. Young, early 20s maybe. Skinny kid with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous smile. Said he was a grad student studying chemistry at the university. Molecular theory, he muttered. I didn't ask too many questions. He had the deposit, clean references, and the promise of quiet. That's all I needed. And for a while, he really was. Rent came on time, and there were no parties, and he had no complaints. And I barely thought about the kid. He was just another name on a lease. He lived in apartment 2B, a tight little one-bedroom unit with squeaky pipes and a south-facing window that overlooked the alley. Not the most luxurious spot in the building, but quiet. The first month was uneventful. The second, too. I barely saw him except for the occasional nod in the hallway. But then, during the fourth month, things began to shift. It started small. Maria from 3B, the apartment directly above James, called me one morning. She said there was a weird smell in her place, like chemicals, like burning plastic, she said. She wasn't angry, just confused and concerned. She thought maybe someone had spilled cleaner or burned something. I told her I'd look into it. I knocked on James's door that afternoon. No answer. I waited a bit, then left a note under the door asking him to give me a call. No call came. It started as a faint irritation, barely worth a phone call. Maria from apartment 3B, directly above James, called one morning around 9 a.m. I remember because I hadn't even had my coffee yet. "There's a smell in my apartment," she said. "Kind of plasticky, like chemicals, maybe something burning." I asked her if it could have been from her place, the stove, a faulty outlet, or even the bar she worked at. She insisted it wasn't. She said it was strongest near the vents, like it was coming from below. I told her I'd look into it, more out of politeness than concern. I'd dealt with a dozen tenant complaints like this before. Usually it was a forgotten pizza box, dirty laundry, or someone trying to light incense with a blowtorch. That afternoon, I knocked on 2B. James didn't answer. I figured he was out or sleeping. I left a note, slipped under the door. No reply. Over the next couple of days, I didn't think much of it, until Maria called again, this time with a harder edge in her voice. "I seriously can't sleep anymore," she said. "It's not just a smell now. It's like acidic. It gets in my nose, in my clothes. I can't breathe near my window." Then, about a week later, Maria called again. Only this time, she was angry. She told me the smell had gotten worse and that she couldn't even open up her windows without gagging. This was different. Her tone wasn't just annoyed, it was distressed. I asked if she'd been feeling sick. She said she'd started getting headaches, even when the window was wide open. I went up to her unit. The moment she cracked her door, I caught a whiff of it. It wasn't garbage. It wasn't mildew. It was sharp, synthetic, something that didn't belong in a home. I walked around her unit, sniffing near the vents, behind the fridge, near the bathroom. Every time, it pointed down toward 2B. I went back to James's door, knocked again. No answer. Again, I slid a note. Then I left a voicemail on his answering machine. "Hey James, it's the landlord. I've had multiple complaints. I need to inspect your unit per the lease. Give me a call, or I'll be coming in." Still no response. The next morning, I found a crumpled note at my office door. No envelope, just torn paper with James's handwriting. "Sorry, deep in research. Smell is temporary. Can we wait until Saturday?" Something about the note felt detached, like he wasn't just busy but removed. Like reality outside his research no longer concerned him. Still, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I called Maria and told her I'd be inspecting the place on Saturday. She didn't sound satisfied, but thanked me anyway. Friday came. I knocked one more time, just in case. No response. Saturday, noon sharp. I stood in front of 2B with keys in hand. I'd given him enough time. But just as I was about to unlock the door, it creaked open. James stood there, eyes bloodshot, face pale. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was stained, His lips were cracked, his posture stiff, like a puppet kept standing by strings. "I was expecting you," he whispered. What I saw inside would change everything. James stepped aside, letting me enter. The moment I crossed the threshold, the smell hit me. Stronger than in Maria's apartment. Sharper, almost electrical. It was as if someone had mixed bleach, burning rubber, and rotting meat in a blender and let it sit. He didn't apologize, didn't explain. He simply said, "Don't touch anything." I blinked as I looked around. The unit was barely recognizable. Gone was any sign of a kitchen or dining area. The counters were overtaken by equipment, glass tubes, vials, wires twisted around clamps, Bunsen burners glowing faintly. A machine in the corner hummed with a low, unsettling frequency. It looked like a combination of an old amplifier and something you'd see in a Frankenstein movie. Metal plates, stacked with tubes and wires feeding into a thick black box that pulsed every few seconds. James walked ahead of me like he'd done this 100 times. His feet were quick, deliberate, dodging coiled wires and notebooks scattered on the floor. I saw symbols in those notes, equations and diagrams, but none I recognized. Some weren't even in English. Some didn't look like writing at all. "James," I said, keeping my voice calm. "What the hell is all this?" He turned, looking genuinely confused by the question. "My work," he replied. "I'm researching molecular restructuring, atomic scaffolding. I'm close." I narrowed my eyes. "Close to what?" He didn't answer immediately, just turned and gestured toward the main table. On it sat 3 glass containers, each filled with different fluids. One was clear and viscous like motor oil. Another was a deep crimson. And the third had something suspended inside. Something that moved slightly, as if it had nerves. I stepped back. "What exactly are you doing in here? Are you making drugs?" James's expression shifted, not to anger, but offense. "No," he said flatly. "This isn't criminal. I could call the university or the police. They'll find nothing illegal." "That may be," I said. "But your setup is making people sick upstairs. I've got to think about the rest of the building." He nodded, almost like he'd expected this part. "I'll scale back," he said. "No more heat sources. I can synthesize more quietly." I wanted to believe him, but I didn't. The look in his eyes wasn't just tired. It was hungry, driven, like he wasn't going to stop even if the world asked him to. Before I left, I glanced once more at that machine in the corner. It pulsed again, and I swear, for just a second, it made the hairs on my arms stand up, like it was alive. "Saturday," I told him. "That's your warning. One more complaint, and I'll have to start eviction." James didn't flinch. He simply turned away, adjusting a dial as if I hadn't said anything at all. As I closed the door behind me, the hum of the machine echoed down the hall. That night, I dreamed of electricity. It didn't even take a week. By Wednesday, Maria called again. This time, there were no pleasantries. "You said you were going to handle it," she snapped. "But it's worse. I swear, something is dying down there. That's not bleach or cleaner. It's biological." She paused. I could hear her breathing hard on the other end. "It smells like something that shouldn't be here. Like if death had a chemical scent." I didn't even argue. I told her eviction papers were being prepared, and I'd serve them by the end of the week. Her voice cracked with relief. Thank God. But less than an hour later, she called again. This time, she wasn't angry. She was screaming. "He's screaming! James is screaming!" I dropped my phone, fumbled it, picked it back up. "He's yelling down there!" she cried. "It's not like yelling. It's like he's burning. He's howling. I already called 911. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my keys and drove, heart pounding, hands shaking. By the time I got to the apartment, sirens were already painting the street in red and blue. People were gathered in clumps on the sidewalk. Some looked worried, others excited. One guy had a camcorder. Maria was standing in the doorway in her pajamas, arms folded, crying. "They broke the door down," she told me, "but no one's come back out." I looked toward 2B. The door hung open. Yellow tape was already being unspooled. A young cop stopped me before I could go in. "You live here?" he asked. "I own the building," I said. "What the hell is going on?" He looked uncomfortable. "We're not sure yet. Please, stay outside. A detective will brief you." I waited and waited. Neighbors whispered rumors. Some said James had exploded. Others said he was cooking meth and blew himself up. One guy muttered that he saw blue light in the window. Another claimed to have seen smoke that moved like liquid. 30 minutes passed before a detective came out. He didn't say much. "There was an incident," he said, carefully. "We'll be in touch." That night, around 8 p.m., my phone rang. It was the detective, and what he told me changed everything. He didn't make it. That was the first thing the detective said. James was dead. I expected to feel vindicated, or maybe just relieved. I'd warned him. I'd given him every chance. But instead, my stomach twisted. Because even though I didn't yet know the details, I knew something wasn't right. The detective didn't say much, only that the scene was highly irregular. He used words like containment, precaution, and chemical event. But he wouldn't say what actually happened in there. He asked me questions, though, lots of them. Had James been acting erratically? Had he mentioned suicidal thoughts? Had I seen any unusual equipment? I told him everything. About the lab setup, the vials, the humming box in the corner, about the smell that had gotten worse by the day, about how James looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. The detective thanked me for my time and told me they'd be sealing the apartment for several days, possibly longer. I didn't press. I didn't want to know more, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. 3 weeks later, the police tape was finally removed. I got the call from the city saying I could re-enter the unit. I wasn't ready, but I had to know. I unlocked the door to 2B with a strange kind of dread, the kind that makes your hands sweat before they even touch metal. The air inside was too still and cold. Most of the furniture had been removed. All the lab equipment was gone. No books, no papers, no wires. It was as if James had never lived there. But then I stepped into the bathroom. That's when I saw it. The burn was deep, too, etched into the metal. But the rest of the bathroom was spotless. And there were no smoke stains and no ash. Just that terrible silhouette, burned into the enamel of the tub. It was shaped like a person. Arms, legs, a head, curled into itself as if the person had tried to shield their body from something impossibly hot. I reached out, touched the edge of the tub. It was cold now, but the black mark looked permanent, etched deep into the porcelain and iron. How does something burn so hot it scorches a person's outline into a cast iron bathtub, and yet leaves the rest of the room untouched? No blackened walls, no scorched tiles. Just the tub. It felt wrong. Like nature had skipped a step. Like physics had bent. I called a contractor the next day. It cost me nearly $800 to rip that tub out and replace it. Worth every cent. I didn't want anyone else seeing what I saw, or feeling what I felt. Because even after the tub was gone, scrubbed, replaced, forgotten, something still lingered in that space. And deep down, I knew the silhouette had never really left. I tried to move on, but I couldn't stop thinking about the silhouette. It wasn't just a burn. It was a scar on reality. Something about it haunted me. The position of the limbs, the unnatural curve of the back, the way the mark had somehow fused into the enamel and iron. I needed answers, so I started digging. I went down to the university where James claimed to be enrolled. After a few polite inquiries and a little pressure, I managed to speak with someone from the chemistry department. They didn't know much, or maybe they didn't want to talk. One lab assistant finally broke his silence. He looked exhausted, pale, like he hadn't slept either. "James didn't take many classes," he said, "but he talked a lot about molecules, rearranging matter, like rewiring atoms." That matched what James had told me weeks ago. "He called it quantum scaffolding," the assistant went on. "He believed matter could be taken apart and reassembled, like Lego." I frowned. "That sounds theoretical, or impossible." The guy just nodded. He was obsessed, said the university was too cautious, that real science required sacrifice. "Sacrifice?" I repeated. He looked away. I left that meeting shaken. What kind of sacrifice was James referring to? I did more digging online, found old forums, archived notes, obscure research articles. James had posted under aliases. I traced them through usernames and writing style. He wasn't just theorizing, he was experimenting. Some of his posts talked about energy fields, electromagnetic disruption, and unlocking cellular memory. One post referenced a technique that required exposure to extreme heat to force molecular detachment. Another hinted at the body as conduit. That one stuck with me. If James believed the human body was a tool in his experiments, was that what caused the silhouette? I called the detective again, asked if I could get a copy of the report. He declined. "Case is closed," he said. "Accidental death due to hazardous chemical misuse. You should be grateful the damage wasn't worse." But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he said it, the unease in his voice, as if he didn't believe it himself. Maria moved out not long after. She didn't give notice, just left the keys in my mailbox with a note. "I can't sleep here anymore. Something's still in the vents." I tried to rent the unit again. People came, people left. The smell never fully faded, no matter how many times we cleaned. I scrubbed the tiles myself one day, just to see if it helped. When I stood in the bathroom, in the space where the tub used to be, I swear I could feel heat on my skin, even though the new tub was cold, even though nothing had burned in weeks. It was like the memory of fire that had seeped into the walls. Weeks passed, then months. Life moved on in the building, but something inside me refused to settle. I'd been a landlord for decades, seen dozens of strange things. But this was different. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything James had said, everything I had seen. Not because I thought anyone would believe me, but because I needed to make sense of it myself. And the more I revisited our last conversation, the more I became convinced of something I couldn't explain. James hadn't died in an accident. He'd tried something, and it had worked, just not the way he wanted. In my notes, I circled that phrase again and again. "I'm close." What did it mean? What was he trying to reach? If he was right? If matter could be rewritten, broken down and put back together, then maybe that machine he'd built hadn't malfunctioned. Maybe it had done exactly what it was meant to, and maybe the silhouette wasn't a result of failure, but of transformation. I remembered one of the posts I'd found under his online alias. It said, "The body must bear the ignition point. Rewriting must begin within." Was that what happened? Did he try to rewrite himself from the inside out? The thought made my skin crawl. I hired a private lab tech off Craigslist, someone desperate for work and willing to keep quiet. I told him I wanted a second opinion in the accident. He brought equipment, sensors, air quality testers, Geiger counters. He spent 4 hours in 2B. When he came out, he looked spooked. "There's no radiation," he said, "but the magnetic field is warped." Warped how? It fluctuates, like a pulse, and the EMF readings spike right where the old tub used to be. I asked if that was dangerous. He just said, "Unnatural." Natural. That word stuck with me. Unnatural. That wasn't science. That was something else. One night, weeks later, I was walking down the hall to check a leaky radiator in Unit 4C. I passed 2B. The door was locked. The lights were off. No one had been inside for days, but as I walked past, I swear I heard it. A hum, faint, barely audible, but low and rhythmic, just like the one from James's machine. It stopped the moment I turned my head. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting, nothing. But I didn't sleep that night. After everything, James's death, the silhouette in the tub, the humming that never quite left. I knew one thing: this could never happen again. So I rewrote my rental agreements. At the bottom of every new lease, bolded and underlined, is a clause. The use, storage, or experimentation of volatile, flammable, reactive, or unknown chemical compounds is strictly prohibited within the premises. Violation will result in immediate termination of tenancy. Tenants read it, then glance up at me, confused. Bit intense, isn't it? They ask, chuckling. I just nod. Sometimes I smile, but it never reaches my eyes, because I know why it's there. I know what burned itself into that tub, and I know it's not entirely gone. The next tenant in 2B stayed only 3 weeks. She came down to my office one morning, pale as a ghost. I keep smelling something, even when the windows are closed. It's in the walls. I offered to send a cleaner. She declined. No, it's not that kind of smell. It's like electricity, metal, like I'm breathing in a wire. She moved out the next day. Others came and went. Some lasted a few months. A couple stayed nearly a year. But all of them, in one way or another, felt it. Something wrong with the place. Some said it was a hum. Others said it was the air, heavier than other rooms. A few mentioned vivid dreams. One guy told me he saw a man-shaped shadow in the steam on the bathroom mirror, but laughed it off like he didn't believe it himself. But I believed him, because I'd seen the mark. I'd touched it. Sometimes I think about what James was really trying to do. Not just chemically, philosophically. He wasn't building a bomb. He wasn't cooking meth. He was trying to remake himself. Maybe even the world. He wanted to take the blueprint of reality and scribble in the margins. But reality doesn't like being rewritten. It pushes back. It punishes. It remembers. And so does that apartment. I haven't entered 2B in over a year now. I hire out repairs. Send contractors. I don't go near it. Not because I'm scared, but because I know one day something will answer back. And when it does, I don't want to be the one standing there when it opens the door. I used to believe lease agreements were just paper, boring legalese to keep the lawyers happy. But now I know better. Some clauses aren't born in offices. They're born in bathtubs, in screams, in silhouettes burned into cast iron. These days, I have a whole new section added to my rental agreements, all about the use of volatile or flammable chemicals within the apartment complex. Some potential tenants, while reading it though, have said things to me like, "Wow, what a weird thing to have to write into a rental agreement." And I tell them that I've seen everything in my years as a landlord. And I imagine I sometimes smile when I say it, too. But I don't imagine that smile reaches my eyes at all. Because whenever someone mentions that little chemical clause, as I call it, I'm reminded of what they say about rules, and how more often than not, they're written in blood. Some nights, I walk past the door to 2B. I stand there, listening. Not for footsteps, not for voices, but for the hum, that soft, pulsing rhythm James's machine once made. The one that sank into the walls like a heartbeat that doesn't need flesh to keep beating. I haven't heard it in a while, but sometimes I feel it in my bones, like the air is warping, folding, trying to find a new shape. And I wonder, what if James wasn't trying to rewrite the world? What if he did? And what if he was just the first draft? People say ghosts are memories, residue, but some things don't just haunt, they wait. And whatever James tried to do in that bathroom, whatever burned his body into the tub, twisted his experiment into a final scream, it didn't end with him. It began. So now I warn every new tenant with a smile I don't mean. And I listen, and I wait, because one day, that hum will come back. And this time, I don't think it will stop at the tub. The man in the trench coat and the jars. I'm from the south side of Chicago, and I'm a landlord who keeps a few run-down buildings afloat. My pops left me 3 6-person apartments in Englewood. Still own 2 of them, and I've been wrenching pipes and cashing rent checks ever since. Even in July when the city's absolutely cooking. His name was Gerald, or at least that's what he put on the lease. He moved in during the summer of '90. The only downside is that every so often he'd come through the door at 3 a.m. carrying whole cases of what sounded like glass bottles. I found the bypass cleanout plug in the basement, set down a bucket to catch any mess, and then popped off the trap and started feeding that snake's cable into the pipe. I started easing it around the bends, probing for any blockage. And then there it was. There, floating in the water, was something I can only describe as a huge snail without a shell. It was like a big lump of slimy gray-green flesh. I just poured the bucket's contents into a larger sewage drain outside. I called out Gerald's name again, just in case he definitely wasn't there. Up and down the walls, above the water heater, Gerald had installed a series of shelves, and lining them were a series of glass jars. They were filled with murky-looking water, and in each one, something was floating. I told him to stop playing with me and asked him again what the hell he blocked my drains with. Then the next morning, I slid it under Gerald's door before I lost my nerve. The old woman said that she'd heard weird noises coming from that apartment at night. Jamal in 3A mentioned seeing Gerald carrying a jar down the fire escape at night, cradling it like it was a real precious thing to him. The stench inside Gerald's apartment was unbearable. That stench stuck around kind of sharp, acidic, and rotten, like it had seeped into the walls and floorboards. The old lady said that she saw something in her bathtub one night, pale and wriggling, gone when she turned on the light. He walked through that area, sprinkled holy water, but it didn't help. In the end, I was forced to sell, and I lost a lot of money on the sale too, because the folks buying knew that they'd have to tear the place down and start again. I wish I had, because that way I'd have thrown Gerald out on his ass the second I saw those jars in his utility closet. No one really knew where Gerald came from. He didn't talk much, didn't mingle. He'd just moved in, like a virus silently entering the bloodstream of an old body already on life support. The building itself groaned like it knew something had arrived. Something wrong. The day he moved in, the air turned heavy. I told myself it was just the heat wave. The city was always muggy in July. But this was different. It felt like the building had exhaled and never breathed in again. Neighbors whispered about him almost instantly. They didn't like the way his footsteps sounded. Too soft. Like he hovered just above the floorboards. One woman swore he never blinked. Another claimed her cat refused to cross the hallway when he passed by. At first, I ignored it. People always complain about something in low-rent housing, but I kept a mental note. Something about Gerald didn't sit right. 2 weeks in, I heard a clatter at 3:17 a.m., looked out my window and saw him dragging a dolly up the steps. On it were crates, glass clinking against glass. He moved like it was weightless, and he never looked around. Just up the stairs and into apartment 2B. The next morning, I checked the lease again. No emergency contact, no job listed, no references. Just Gerald R. and a P.O. box in Ohio. Weird. Sure, but not illegal. And like I said, he paid early, always in cash. Still, the building changed. The pipe started groaning at odd hours. The radiator in the hallway hissed even when it wasn't cold. Tenants reported water discoloration, gray-green, like something had bled into it. I filed maintenance reports, ran inspections. But I knew, deep down, I knew it wasn't the building falling apart. It was reacting to him. It was a Tuesday when the first real incident happened. Mrs. Caro, the widow in 1A, knocked on my door with a face pale as paint and a shaking cat wrapped in a towel. She said the basement was flooding, and the smell, she covered her mouth and almost retched, wasn't just sewage. It was something else. Like meat left out too long, she whispered. I knew the plumbing in that building like the back of my hand. My father taught me every line, every shut-off valve, every workaround for the cheap fixes he'd done over the years. I grabbed my flashlight, gloves, and the manual drain snake and headed down to the basement. The lights flickered as I opened the door. The air hit me like a wall, wet, warm, and sour. It clung to my clothes, my skin, my throat. The concrete floor was slick with a thin film of black water. In the center, a drain burbled like it was trying to breathe. I set the bucket down, opened the bypass cleanout, and started feeding the snake. Each turn of the crank echoed in the silence. Something was in there, not a usual clog. It pushed back. It pulsed. Then it gave way with a wet, sucking pop. Out spilled water and sludge, and something else. I didn't want to look, but I had to, whatever it was. It sat curled like an embryo, mottled gray and green, twitching once before going still. I shoved the bucket away, bile rising in my throat, and backed out of the basement. That night I didn't sleep. The next morning, I dumped it in the street drain and prayed it was just a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the shape, the way it almost seemed vertebrate. A week passed. I made excuses not to go near the basement, but tenants kept calling. Odd noises, faucets turning on by themselves, smell creeping back. I asked Gerald directly if he'd noticed anything strange. He stared at me for a beat too long before shaking his head. Pipes groan, he said. Old buildings do that. The next day, I caught him on the fire escape. He had something in his arms. It was a jar, sealed tight, sloshing with dark fluid. Whatever floated inside it pressed against the glass like it wanted out. He cradled it like a child. I stepped back inside, closed the curtain, and locked the window. Then, 3 nights later, I heard something crawling inside the walls. Not rats, too big, too wet. I tapped the plaster with my knuckles. Silence. Then a scrape. A low, dragging scrape, like something with no bones was pulling itself deeper into the building. And for the first time, I started to believe Gerald wasn't just weird. He was dangerous. I'd had enough. Too many calls. Too many nightmares about soft, wet shapes moving just out of view. It wasn't just the plumbing. It wasn't just bad luck. Something in that building was changing, and I had to know why. The city inspector wasn't due for another 2 weeks, and Gerald, despite his creepiness, had technically done nothing illegal. So I told myself what I needed to hear. I had a duty to my tenants, a legal right to inspect potential health hazards. But deep down, I wasn't thinking about the law. I just wanted to see what he was hiding. He hadn't been seen in 2 days. The lights in 2B stayed off. The mailbox overflowed. I knocked 3 times. Nothing. No sound. No shuffling inside. I slipped in the spare key. Immediately, the air changed. Cooler, like walking into a cave. The curtains were drawn, but light leaked through, illuminating thick motes of dust swirling like spores. The place was chaos. Furniture mismatched. Upholstery torn. Dozens of houseplants lined the windowsills and counters, most of them dead or withering. But some weren't plants at all. They had shapes too fluid, too soft. One pulsed slightly in the dark. I didn't dare touch it. Books lay stacked in uneven towers, most of them in languages I couldn't begin to read. Latin, maybe, or older. The covers bulged with moisture and strange bookmarks. Bones, feathers, curled bits of what looked like dried tentacle. I whispered Gerald's name. Nothing. A narrow hallway led to the back, and at the end stood a metal door that didn't belong. It was bolted with a padlock, the kind of lock you don't use on a utility closet unless you're hiding something more than spare bulbs. I tried the key, no dice, so I drove home, grabbed my bolt cutters, and came back before sunset. I didn't want to be there at night. The lock snapped louder than I expected. The door groaned open. The smell hit me first. Stagnant water and undercut with something sharp and metallic. The room was lined with shelves, and on them sat dozens of glass jars. Each one held a different creature. I use that word carefully, because they were not animals. Not any I'd ever seen. Some looked like pieces, slices of larger things. Others twitched faintly as if dreaming. One jar had what looked like a tiny face pressed to the glass, eyes bulbous and unblinking. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then a floorboard creaked behind me. I turned, and there he was, Gerald, standing in the hallway, pale, watching. He didn't yell, didn't rush, just stared at me like I was the intruder in his home. Not his apartment, but his home, his habitat. "What are you doing?" he asked. And it wasn't angry. It was curious, like he genuinely didn't know why I was scared. I told him I was investigating a clog, that the smell was causing complaints, that I needed to inspect all water sources. He looked past me, at the jars. "They're sleeping," he said softly. "Don't wake them." I should have left. Should have backed away slowly and said I'd be back with city inspectors. But I didn't. Instead, I asked, "What are they?" Gerald blinked once. "Visitors." "From where?" He smiled. "Not where, when." That was enough for me. I brushed past him and nearly sprinted down the hallway. I heard him whisper as I fled. "They get angry when they're cold." I didn't know what that meant. I didn't want to know, but I knew then. And fast. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in the walls sounded like wet skin sliding. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper. The phrase, "they get angry when they're cold," looped in my brain like a curse. The next morning, I typed up the eviction notice. Lease violations, unauthorized modifications, safety concerns. I threw everything I could into the document. I printed it, signed it with a trembling hand, and slid it under Gerald's door. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge it, but his neighbors did. Jamal told me he saw Gerald out on the fire escape again, whispering to the jar, rocking it gently. The old woman in 1A said her cat had vanished, and she swore she heard it meowing from inside the bathroom walls. 3 days later, the stench returned. I walked into the building, and it hit me like a blow to the face. Rotten meat, ammonia, and something else. Something earthy and unnatural. I climbed the stairs to 2B and noticed trails of black slime near the base of the door. I didn't knock. I didn't dare. Instead, I called Nicky. My cousin's a cop. One of the good ones. I told him everything. The jars, the creatures, the whispers. He said it sounded like I'd stumbled onto either a cult or a psycho. Either way, I needed to be careful. But he also reminded me, without drugs, bodies, or a direct threat, they couldn't intervene. "Just get him out legally," he said. "Evict him. Don't escalate." So I waited. Gerald never left his apartment, at least not by the front. But tenants claimed to hear footsteps on the roof, scratching in the vents. One said they heard a voice chanting from the basement in a language that made their ears bleed. I didn't believe that part, not really, until I checked the cameras, motion alerts from the basement. Time stamped 3:13 a.m. every night for a week. I played back the footage, expecting rats or vagrants. Instead, I saw Gerald, standing barefoot on the flooded concrete, surrounded by candles, holding one of the jars high above his head. He was praying, not to God, not in English. I shut the laptop, threw up in the sink. The next morning, I called a priest. Father Roland from St. Sabina's came with his silver cross and a bottle of holy water. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to make him say yes. He walked the halls in silence, muttered Latin, sprinkled water at every door. When he reached 2B, he stopped. The bottle in his hand hissed like it had touched fire. He didn't knock, just stared at the door, murmured a blessing, and walked away faster than he had anywhere else. Something lives there, he said once outside. But not a man, not anymore. I doubled Gerald's eviction date, posted it again, final warning, still no response. But that night, someone or something knocked on my door 3 times, and when I opened it, no one was there, just a jar. Sitting on the welcome mat, filled with something gray and pulsing. I didn't touch it. I called Nicky again. He came in person this time, but when we opened it, the jar was empty. No fluid, no creature, just glass, and the smell of something that should have never breathed. The final week of his lease passed like a countdown to disaster. The air in the building thickened. Tenants began complaining of headaches, nosebleeds, and migraines. One woman said she heard crying from the drains in her kitchen sink. Another swore her ceiling bulged like something was crawling above the drywall. I offered rent discounts, even paid for hotel nights just to keep people calm. But deep inside, I was spiraling. I checked Gerald's door daily, still locked, still silent. I left another note, this time a final notice taped to the frame in red ink. And then, the night before his 30 days expired, I got a call. It was Mrs. Caro. She was hysterical. "He's screaming!" she sobbed. "He's screaming and it smells like something's dying!" I grabbed my flashlight and keys and drove faster than I ever had. The hallway outside 2B was fogged with odor. The smell was so intense it felt physical, like a heat wave made of rotting teeth and vinegar. My eyes watered. My lungs fought every breath. The door was unlocked. Inside, the apartment was empty. Furniture gone. Plants dead. Books torn and scattered. The only thing left behind was a single glass jar, shattered on the kitchen floor. Its contents spilled into a black puddle that hissed and bubbled like acid. And above that puddle, scratches. Deep ones. They trailed across the floor, up the walls, into the vents, like something had been dragged or crawled out. I stumbled back out into the hallway and slammed the door. Nicky arrived 20 minutes later, and for once, he didn't argue. He saw the residue. He smelled the air. "Biohazard," he muttered, shaking his head. "Hazmat only. It cost me over $1,000. But the cleanup crew came, suited head to toe in yellow plastic. They didn't ask questions. They never do. Just nodded when I said chemical spill and started scraping the floor. I thought that was the end. I thought I could move on. But the building had other plans. Even with Gerald gone, the pipes moaned. The lights dimmed at 3:13 sharp every night. And the smell, muted, but present, never really left. One night, Jamal knocked on my door. He was pale, his eyes glassy. "My son saw something," he whispered. He said it was like Gerald, but bigger. It came out of the tub drain. It looked at him. I tried to laugh it off, I really did, but the look on Jamal's face stopped me. I gave him 2 months free rent. He moved out the next day. Others followed. By the end of summer, half the units were empty. I couldn't keep up with the mortgage. Couldn't stomach walking those halls. I'd close my eyes and hear that chant from the basement. See that jar on my doorstep. So I sold the building, cheap. The buyers were a development group, said they'd tear it down and rebuild from the ground up. Asked me what caused the damage. I said the truth. I don't know, and I meant it, because whatever Gerald brought with him, whatever those jars held, was older than plumbing, older than walls. It didn't come from another city. It came from another world, or worse, another time. I thought selling the place would be the end of it. I signed the papers, transferred the deed, and walked away with a pitiful check that didn't even cover my debt. I figured I'd never see that building again. Just a chapter closed, a nightmare boxed and shelved. But nightmares have a way of following you home. 2 weeks after the sale, I started waking up at 3:13, not once, not twice, every single night. At first, I thought it was habit, a lingering trauma, but it was always the same. Bolt upright, cold sweat, heart pounding. And outside my window, a faint smell, a trace of mold and metal and rot. I moved across town, changed my number, got a new P.O. box, tried to rebuild. But no matter where I went, I kept hearing the same stories from people in the neighborhood. That place, yeah, they tried to renovate it. Workers kept quitting. Foreman said something climbed out of a sinkhole in the basement. I heard they called in exorcists, not just one, 3 of them. By the time fall rolled around, the developers had fenced off the property, and by winter, the building was gone, leveled, demolished, razed right down to the foundation. I thought that would be it, but then the dreams began. Always the same. Me, walking into 2B, except it wasn't the apartment anymore. It was a tunnel. Wet, slick walls, glowing faintly green. And jars, so many jars, lined on ledges carved into the stone. Some were cracked, some were open, and something slithered between them. I never saw its face, only heard the scraping, woke up gasping every time. Then came the letters. 1. Slipped under my door with no return address. Inside, a photo, a picture of a basement floor, my old building, before demolition. In the center, the concrete was cracked, and something was reaching out of it. Something that looked like a hand, but it had too many joints. Another time, I received a voicemail from an unknown number. A child's voice whispered, "They're not gone, just sleeping." I threw the phone into the river. Didn't matter. 2 days later, I got another. Same message, same voice. That's when I started digging. Not literally, at least not at first. I went to the archives, pulled zoning documents, tenant records, even newspaper clippings. I found a photo of the original building from 1913. It was a boarding house back then. And in the window of the second floor, staring out into the street, a figure in a long coat. The caption under the photo named the owner, G.R. Went. I flipped the page. A local obituary listed the death of a G.R. Went in 1946. Murdered. Found with dozens of preserved animals in jars lining the basement. Cause of death, unknown. House condemned. Demolished in 1940. Same plot of land. Same address. Same address. My building had been rebuilt in 1950. I stared at the date, and I realized something. Gerald didn't move in. He came back. Or maybe, he never left. I didn't expect the smell to return. Not after demolition. Not after relocation. But one night, while standing on my apartment balcony, it hit me like a memory soaked in rot. That same mix of decay, wet stone, and copper. I spun around, half expecting to see a jar behind me, but the balcony was empty. Only the breeze carried it, like it had traveled miles just to find me again. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was psychological. PTSD. That's what my therapist called it when I finally agreed to talk. But therapists don't explain cold water dripping from ceiling vents in a building with central air. They don't explain how my kitchen light dimmed to green every night at 3:13, or how I woke one morning to find my sink filled with brackish liquid, and something wriggling just beneath the surface. That was the night I saw him, not Gerald exactly, but something shaped like him. It stood across the street, in the shadow of a telephone pole. trench coat flapping slightly in wind that didn't move anything else. It didn't wave, didn't speak, just watched, and then it was gone. I didn't sleep again. I started researching again. Found out more about the lot on Englewood. Apparently, the new foundation cracked within days. Contractors reported tools going missing. Strange fog collecting only in the basement area. Some workers quit on the spot. One even went missing. The city paused development, then quietly canceled it. The lot is still fenced up. Weeds grown tall, foundation half poured. And people in the neighborhood say you can still hear humming from underground. Low. Wet. Rhythmic. I drove by one afternoon just to see it. The gate was padlocked, but through the slats, I saw a jar sitting at the edge of the rubble. A new one. The glass gleamed like it had just been cleaned. Something floated inside, shifting slowly, like it was dreaming. I turned and left, sped home, locked every door and window. That night, I got a package. No return address, no markings. Inside, a newspaper clipping from 19T to same one I'd seen before. But this time, a handwritten message had been scrawled in red across the top. They were always here. I dropped the paper like it burned. Then the power went out, not just in my apartment, in the whole block. Emergency lights flickered on in the hallway, and from the air vents above my bed, something dripped. Slow. Thick. It smelled like Gerald. I packed a bag that night. Essentials only. Cash. Burner phone. Passport I hadn't used in years. I told myself I'd head south, maybe west. Someplace warm, dry, far from Chicago and any building older than a decade. But when I opened my front door, the jar was there, sitting upright, waiting. This one was different. Larger than before. The glass thicker, clouded from the inside. And instead of the usual dark liquid, this one held something clearer, pale gold, like honey left to rot. Something moved inside. Dua. I stepped back, ready to shut the door and pretend it wasn't there. When I heard it, my name, whispered, faint, from inside the jar. I slammed the door and bolted every lock. My hands were shaking. My heart felt like it was going to punch through my chest. I paced the apartment, lights flicking, floors creaking. Then the knocking began. Soft, steady, rhythmic. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks again, always at 3:13. I didn't answer. Couldn't. I hid in the closet like a child, knees drawn to my chest, clutching a flashlight whose beam hemmed with each second. Hours passed. The next morning, I cracked the door. No jar, no note, just footprints, wet, bare, leading from my doorstep down the hall and out the building. I didn't follow. I left Chicago that day. I drove until I ran out of road. Slept in motels, ate out of vending machines, kept moving, but it didn't help. Everywhere I went, they followed. One night in Amarillo, Texas, I checked into a roadside inn. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old smoke. I opened the nightstand drawer to find a Bible. Standard. Under it, a jar. I dropped it. It didn't break. Instead, it rolled in a perfect circle, stopped, and faced me. The thing inside blinked. I screamed, ran, didn't even grab my bag, kept running. At some point, I stopped going indoors altogether. Slept in my car, washed at gas stations, moved only at noon, avoided shadows. It didn't help. The jars kept finding me. Some left on picnic tables, some in restroom stalls. One was floating in the river, where I tried to drown the phone. No one else saw them. I asked a woman once, pointed to a jar sitting on a bus stop bench and asked, "What do you think's in there?" She frowned. "There's nothing there." That was when I knew I was the only one marked, that whatever Gerald had brought into the world, he'd passed to me. I wasn't a landlord anymore. I was a courier, a vessel, and somewhere inside me, I felt it growing. One night, as I lay in the back seat of my car, I woke up choking, my mouth filled with liquid, not spit, not blood, something thicker, saltier, golden. I coughed it up, gasping, only to find a lid in my hand, glass, threaded, a jar lid. I dropped it and ran barefoot into the night. Now I don't sleep, I don't stay anywhere long, but even now, wherever I go, I still smell him, and I know one day soon, they'll come collect. No one believes you when you say you're being followed by jars. It sounds ridiculous, absurd, but absurdity doesn't stop reality from creeping in through the cracks. And by now, I know the signs, the smell, the chill at 3:13, the impossible silence before it begins. Sometimes I wake up with new bruises, circular, like something cupped my skin and pressed down gently, as if to remind me, you're still chosen. I've grown thinner, pale. My eyes are always dry. My fingernails curve inward slightly, like the shells of snails. I visited a doctor once, told him I'd been poisoned, told him to test my blood. He said it looked normal, but when he stepped out, I looked at the monitor. My heartbeat wasn't a wave. It pulsed like something swimming. I left without saying goodbye. Lately, I've been hearing the voices, not loud, not in my ears, but under them, below hearing, below thought. They murmur in rhythms, rise and fall like breath. Sometimes I feel them in my teeth, like vibrations echoing through bone. I've tried every method I can think of. Cleansing rituals, salt circles, fire. I even found an occultist in Phoenix who agreed to unbind me. He screamed when he opened the circle, said something, looked back, wouldn't speak to me again. The next week, he vanished. His storefront now sells vape pens. I know what they want. Not revenge, not destruction, memory. They want to be remembered, stored, preserved. They want jars, and I'm their archive. The worst part, I've started to understand their language. In my dreams, I know the syllables, the cadence, when a phrase repeats the most. Host becomes vessel, vessel becomes hive. I don't know what that means, but I think I'm learning. Last week, I found a new jar, but this one wasn't sealed. It was open, empty, waiting. They found my car yesterday, abandoned on a rural highway in New Mexico. Engine still warm, headlights on, no sign of forced entry, no blood, no prints. Just one thing left behind. A jar, sealed, glowing faintly from within. The police released a photo to the press, hoping someone could identify it. They won't, but I know what they'll find if they open it. They'll see me, not my face, not my body, but pieces, my voice, my memories, my fear, trapped in fluid, floating in a place where time doesn't move forward, just down, because that's what the hive does. It collects, and it keeps. You don't escape it, you become it. The buzzing never stops now, even in silence, even in the void. I feel it behind the world's walls, humming through metal pipes, whispering in flickering bulbs, slithering through the dark, wet cracks between dimensions we only think are sealed. Somewhere beneath Englewood, the ground still breathes. The concrete might be gone, but the tunnels are not. And in those tunnels, they're growing, feeding, cataloging, waiting for the next vacancy. You'll know when it's time. You'll smell it. You'll feel it. And one night, you'll wake up to find a jar on your doorstep. No note, no warning, just glass, and something watching from inside, because the hive remembers, and it's always expanding.